Section 21 of the Best Short Stories of 1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Adam Benckeser. Zelig by Benjamin Rosenblatt. From The Bellman. Old Zelig was eyed askance by his brethren. No one deigned to call him Reb Zelig, nor to prefix to his name the American equivalent, Mr. "The old one is a barrel with a stave missing," knowingly declared his neighbors. "He never spends a cent, and he belongs nowheres." For to belong on New York's east side is of no slight importance. It means being a member in one of the numberless congregations. Every decent Jew must join a society for burying its members, to be provided at least with a narrow cell at the end of the long road. Zelig was not even a member of one of these. "Alone like a stone," his wife often sighed. In the cloak shop where Zelig worked, he stood daily, brandishing his heavy iron on the sizzling cloth, hardly ever glancing about him. The workmen despised him, for during a strike he returned to work after 2 days' absence. He could not be idle, and thought with dread of the Saturday that would bring him no pay envelope. His very appearance seemed alien to his brethren. His figure was tall and of cast-iron mold. When he stared stupidly at something, he looked like a blind Samson. His gray hair was long, and it fell in disheveled curls on gigantic shoulders somewhat inclined to stoop. His shabby clothes hung loosely on him, and, both summer and winter, the same old cap covered his massive head. He had spent most of his life in a sequestered village in Little Russia, where he tilled the soil and even wore the national peasant costume. When his son and only child, a poor widower with a boy of 12 on his hands, emigrated to America, the father's heart bled. Yet he chose to stay in his native village at all hazards, and to die there. One day, however, a letter arrived from the son that he was sick. This sad news was followed by words of a more cheerful nature. "And your grandson Moses goes to public school. He is almost an American, and he is not forced to forget the God of Israel. He will soon be confirmed. His bar mitzvah is near." Zelig's wife wept 3 days and nights upon the receipt of this letter. The old man said little, but he began to sell his few possessions. To face the world outside his village spelled agony to the poor rustic. Still, he thought he would get used to the new home which his son had chosen. But the strange journey with locomotive and steamship bewildered him dreadfully, and the clamor of the metropolis into which he was flung pell-mell altogether stupefied him. With a vacant air he regarded the pandemonium, and a petrification of his inner being seemed to take place. He became a barrel with a stave missing. No spark of animation visited his eye. Only one thought survived in his brain, and one desire pulsed in his heart: to save money enough for himself and family to hurry back to his native village. Blind and dead to everything, he moved about with a dumb, lacerating pain in his heart. He longed for home. Before he found steady employment, he walked daily with titanic strides through the entire length of Manhattan, while children and even adults often slunk into byways to let him pass. Like a huge monster, he seemed, with an arrow in his vitals. In the shop where he found a job at last, the workmen feared him at first, but ultimately finding him a harmless giant, they more than once hurled their sarcasms at his head. Of the many men and women employed there, only one person had the distinction of getting fellowship from old Zelig. That person was the Gentile watchman or janitor of the shop, a little blond Pole with an open mouth and frightened eyes. And many were the witticisms aimed at this uncouth pair. "The big one looks like an elephant," the joker of the shop would say. "Only he likes to be fed on pennies instead of peanuts." "Oi, oi, his nose would betray him," the philosopher of the shop chimed in, and during the dinner hour he would expatiate thus: "You see, money is his blood. He starves himself to have enough dollars to go back to his home. The Pole told me all about it. And why should he stay here? Freedom of religion means nothing to him. He never goes to synagogue. And freedom of the press? Bah, he never even reads the conservative Tageblatt. Old Zelig met such jibes with stoicism. Only rarely would he turn up the whites of his eyes, as if in the act of ejaculation. But he would soon contract his heavy brows into a scowl, and emphasize the last with a heavy thump of his sizzling iron. When the frightful cry of the massacred Jews in Russia rang across the Atlantic, and the ghetto of Manhattan paraded one day through the narrow streets draped in black, through the erstwhile clamorous thoroughfares steeped in silence, stores and shops bolted, a wail of anguish issuing from every door and window, the only one remaining in his shop that day was old Zelig. His fellow workmen did not call upon him to join the procession. They felt the incongruity of this brute in line with mourners in muffled tread. And the Gentile watchman reported the next day that the moment the funeral dirge of the music echoed from a distant street, Zelig snatched off the greasy cap he always wore, and in confusion instantly put it on again. All the rest of the day, the Pole related with awe, he looked wilder than ever, and so thumped with his iron on the cloth that I feared the building would come down. But Zelig paid little heed to what was said about him. He dedicated his existence to the saving of his earnings, and only feared that he might be compelled to spend some of them. More than once his wife would be appalled in the dark of night by the silhouette of old Zelig in nightdress, sitting up in bed and counting a bundle of banknotes which he always replaced under his pillow. She frequently upbraided him for his niggardly nature, for his warding off all requests outside the pittance for household expense. She pleaded, exhorted, wailed. He invariably answered, "I haven't a cent, by my soul." She pointed to the bare walls, the broken furniture, their beggarly attire. "Our son is ill," she moaned. "He needs special food and rest, and our grandson is no more a baby. He'll soon need money for his studies. Dark is my world. You are killing both of them." Zelig's color vanished. His old hands shook with emotion. The poor woman thought herself successful, but the next moment he would gasp, "Not a cent, by my soul." One day, old Zelig was called from his shop because his son had a sudden severe attack, and as he ascended the stairs of his home, a neighbor shouted, "Run for a doctor! The patient cannot be revived!" A voice, as if from a tomb, suddenly sounded in reply, "I haven't a cent, by my soul." The hallway was crowded with the ragged tenants of the house, mostly women and children. From far off were heard the rhythmic cries of the mother. The old man stood for a moment, as if chilled from the roots of his hair to the tips of his fingers. Then the neighbors heard his sepulchral mumble, "I'll have to borrow somewheres, beg someone," as he retreated down the stairs. He brought a physician, and when the grandson asked for money to go for the medicine, Zelig snatched the prescription and hurried away, still murmuring, "I'll have to borrow. I'll have to beg." Late that night, the neighbors heard a wail issuing from old Zelig's apartment, and they understood that the son was no more. Zelig's purse was considerably thinned. He drew from it with palsied fingers for all burial expenses, looking about him in a dazed way. Mechanically, he performed the Hebrew rites for the dead, which his neighbors taught him. He took a knife and made a deep gash in his shabby coat. Then he removed his shoes, seated himself on the floor, and bowed his poor old head, tearless, benumbed. The shop stared when the old man appeared after the prescribed 3 days' absence. Even the Pole dared not come near him. A film seemed to coat his glaring eye. Deep wrinkles contracted his features, and his muscular frame appeared to shrink even as one looked. From that day on, he began to starve himself more than ever. The passion for sailing back to Russia, to die at home at last, lost but little of its original intensity. Yet there was something now which by a feeble thread bound him to the New World. In a little mound on the Beis Akayim, the House of Life, under a tombstone engraved with Old Hebrew script, a part of himself lay buried. But he kept his thoughts away from that mound. How long and untiringly he kept on saving. Age gained on him with rapid strides. He had little strength left for work, but his dream of home seemed nearing its realization. Only a few more weeks, a few more months, and the thought sent a glow of warmth to his frozen frame. He would even condescend now to speak to his wife concerning the plans he had formed for their future welfare, more especially when she revived her pecuniary complaints. "See what you have made of us, of the poor child," she often argued, pointing to the almost grown grandson. "Since he left school, he works for you, and what will be the end?" At this, Zelig's heart would suddenly clutch, as if conscious of some indistinct, remote fear. His answers touching the grandson were abrupt, incoherent, as of one who replies to a question unintelligible to him, and is in constant dread lest his interlocutor should detect it. Bitter misgivings concerning the boy began to mingle with the reveries of the old man. At first he hardly gave a thought to him. The boy grew noiselessly. The ever-surging tide of secular studies that runs so high on the east side caught this boy in its wave. He was quietly preparing himself for college. In his eagerness to accumulate the required sum, Zelig paid little heed to what was going on around him. And now, on the point of victory, he became aware with growing dread of something a-brewing out of the common. He sniffed suspiciously, and one evening he overheard the boy talking to Grandma about his hatred of Russian despotism, about his determination to remain in the States. He ended by entreating her to plead with Grandpa to promise him the money necessary for a college education. Old Zelig swooped down upon them with wild eyes. "Much you need it, you stupid!" he thundered at the youngster in unrestrained fury. "You will continue your studies in Russia, Durak, stupid!" His timid wife, however, seemed suddenly to gather courage, and she exploded. "Yes, you should give your savings for the child's education here. Woe is me! In the Russian universities, no Jewish children are taken." Old Zelig's face grew purple. He rose and abruptly seated himself again. Then he rushed madly, with a raised, menacing arm, at the boy in whom he saw the formidable foe, the foe he had so long been dreading. But the old woman was quick to interpose with a piercing shriek. "You madman! Look at the sick child! You forget from what our son died, going out like a flickering candle." That night, Zelig tossed feverishly on his bed. He could not sleep. For the first time, it dawned upon him what his wife meant by pointing to the sickly appearance of the child. When the boy's father died, the physician declared that the cause was tuberculosis. He rose to his feet. Beads of cold sweat glistened on his forehead, trickled down his cheeks, his beard. He stood pale and panting. Like a startling sound, the thought entered his mind. The boy. What should be done with the boy? The dim blue light gleamed in through the windows. All was shrouded in the city silence, which yet has a peculiar, monotonous ring in it. Somewhere, an infant awoke with a sickly cry which ended in a suffocating cough. The grizzled old man bestirred himself, and with hasty steps, he tiptoed to the place where the boy lay. For a time, he stood gazing on the pinched features, the undersized body of the lad. Then he raised one hand, passed it lightly over the boy's hair, stroking his cheeks and chin. The boy opened his eyes, looked for a moment at the shriveled form bending over him. Then he petulantly closed them again. "You hate to look at Grandpa. He is your enemy, eh?" The aged man's voice shook and sounded like that of the child's awaking in the night. The boy made no answer, but the old man noticed how the frail body shook, how the tears rolled, washing the sunken cheeks. For some moments he stood mute. Then his form literally shrank to that of a child's as he bent over the ear of the boy and whispered hoarsely, "You are weeping, eh? Grandpa is your enemy, you stupid. Tomorrow I will give you the money for the college. You hate to look at Grandpa. He is your enemy, eh?" End of section 21.
Section 22 of the Best Short Stories of 1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Vanessa Fernandez. The Survivors. A Memorial Day Story by Elsie Singmaster. In the year 1868, when Memorial Day was instituted, Fosterville had 35 men in its parade. Fosterville was a border town. In it, enthusiasm had run high, and many more men had enlisted than those required by the draft. All the men were on the same side, but Adam Faust, who, slipping away, joined himself to the troops of his mother's southern state. It could not have been any great trial for Adam to fight against most of his companions in Fosterville, for there was only one of them with whom he did not quarrel. That one was his cousin Henry, for whom he was inseparable. Henry was a frank, open-hearted lad who would have lived on good terms with the whole world if Adam had allowed him to. Adam did not return to Fosterville until the morning of the first Memorial Day, of whose establishment he was unaware. He had been ill for months, and it was only now that he had earned enough to make his way home. He was slightly lame. He had lost 2 fingers of his left hand. He got down from the train at the station and found himself at once in a great crowd. He knew no one, and no one seemed to know him. Without asking any questions, he started up the street. He meant to go, first of all, to the house of his cousin Henry, and then to set about making arrangements to resume his long interrupted business, that of a saddler, which he could still follow in spite of his injury. As he hurried along, he heard the sound of band music and realized that some sort of a procession was advancing. With the throng about him, he pressed to the curb. The tune was one which he hated. The colors he hated also. The marchers, all but one, he had never liked. There was Newton Town, with the sergeant's stripe on his blue sleeve. There was Edward Green, a captain. There was Peter Allanson, a color-bearer. At their head, taller, handsomer, dearer than ever to Adam's jealous eyes, walked Henry Faust. In an instant of forgetfulness, Adam waved his hand, but Henry did not see. Adam chose to think that he saw and would not answer. The veterans passed, and Adam drew back and was lost in the crowd. But Adam had a parade of his own. In the evening, when the music and the speeches were over, and the half-dozen graves of those of Fosterville's young men who had been brought home had been heaped with flowers, and Fosterville sat on doorsteps and porches talking about the day, Adam put on a grey uniform and walked from one end of the village to the other. These were people who had known him always. The word flew from step to step. Many persons spoke to him. Some laughed, and a few jeered. To no one did Adam pay any heed. Past the house of Newton Town, past the store of Edward Green, past the wide lawn of Henry Faust, walked Adam, his hands clasped behind his back, as though to make more perpendicular than perpendicularity itself that stiff backbone. Henry Faust ran down the steps and out to the gate. "Oh, Adam!" cried he. Adam stopped, stock still. He could see Peter Allinson and Newton Town and even Ed Green on Henry's porch. They were all having ice cream and cake together. "Well, what?" said he roughly. "Won't you shake hands with me?" "No," said Adam. "Won't you come in?" "Never." Still Henry persisted. "Someone might do you harm, Adam." "Let them," said Adam. Then Adam walked on alone. Adam walked alone for 40 years. Not only on Memorial Day did he don his grey uniform and make the rounds of the village. When the Fosterville Grand Army Post met on Friday evenings in the post room, Adam managed to meet most of the members either going or returning. He and his grey suit became gradually so familiar to the village that no one turned his head or glanced up from book or paper to see him go by. He had from time to time a new suit, and he ordered from somewhere in the south a succession of grey, broad-brimmed military hats. The farther the war sank into the past, the straighter grew old Adam's back, the prouder his head. Sometimes, early in the 40 years, the acquaintances of his childhood, especially the women, remonstrated with him. "The war's over, Adam," they would say. "Can't you forget it?" "Those GAR fellows don't forget it," Adam would answer. "They haven't changed their principles. Why should I change mine?" "But you might make up with Henry." "That's nobody's business but my own." "But when you were children you were never separated." "Make up, Adam." "When Henry needs me, I'll help him," said Adam. "Henry will never need you. Look at all he's got." "Well then, I don't need him," declared Adam. As he walked away, he went back to his saddler's shop, where he sat all day stitching. He had ample time to think of Henry and the past. "Brought up like twins," he would say, "sharing like brothers." Now he has a fine business and a fine house and fine children, and I have nothing. But I have my principles. I ain't never truckled to him. Some day he'll need me. You'll see. As Adam grew older, it became more and more certain that Henry would never need him for anything. Henry tried again and again to make friends, but Adam would have none of him. He talked more and more to himself as he sat at his work. Used to help him over the brook and bait his hook for him. Even built corncob houses for him to knock down. That much littler he was than me. Stepped out of the race when I found he wanted Annie. He might ask me for something. Adam seemed often to be growing childish. By the year 1875, 15 of Fosterville's 35 veterans had died. The men who survived the war were, for the most part, not strong men, and weaknesses established in prisons and on long marches asserted themselves. 15 times the Fosterville Post paraded to the cemetery and read its committal service and fired its salute. For these parades, Adam did not put on his grey uniform. During the next 20 years, deaths were fewer. Fosterville prospered as never before. It built factories and an electric car line. Of all its enterprises, Henry Faust was at the head. He enlarged his house and bought farms and grew handsomer as he grew older. Everybody loved him. All Fosterville, except Adam, sought his company. It seemed sometimes as though Adam would almost die from loneliness and jealousy. Henry Faust sittin' with Ed Green, said Adam to himself, as though he could never accustom his eyes to this phenomenon. Henry consortin' with Newtown. The Grand Army Post also grew in importance. It paraded each year with more ceremony. It imported fine music and great speakers for Memorial Day. Presently, the sad procession to the cemetery began once more. There was a long, cold winter with many cases of pneumonia, and 3 veterans succumbed. There was an intensely hot summer, and twice in 1 month the post read its committal service and fired its salute. A few years more, and the post numbered but 3. Past them, still on post evenings, walked Adam, head in air, hands clasped behind his back. There was Edward Green, round, fat, who puffed and panted. There was Newton Town, who walked in spite of palsy, as though he had won the Battle of Gettysburg. There was, last of all, Henry Faust, who at 75 was hale and strong. Usually, a tall son walked beside him, or a grandchild clung to his hand. He was almost never alone. It was as though everyone who knew him tried to have as much as possible of his company. Past him with a grave nod walked Adam. Adam was 2 years older than Henry. It required more and more stretching of arms behind his back to keep his shoulders straight. In April, Newton Town was taken ill and died. Edward Green was terrified, though he considered himself, in spite of his shortness of breath, a strong man. "Don't let anything happen to you, Henry," he would say. "Don't let anything get you, Henry. I can't march alone." "I'll be there," Henry would reassure him. Only one look at Henry, and the most alarmed would have been comforted. "It would kill me to march alone," said Edward Green. As if Fosterville realized that it could not continue long to show its devotion to its veterans, it made this year special preparations for Memorial Day. The Fosterville band practiced elaborate music. The children were drilled in marching. The children were to precede the veterans to the cemetery and were to scatter flowers over the graves. Houses were gaily decorated. Flags and banners floated in the pleasant spring breeze. Early in the morning, carriages and wagons began to bring in the country folk. Adam Faust realized, as well as Fosterville, that the parades of veterans were drawing to their close. "This may be the last time I can show my principles," said he, with grim setting of his lips. "I will put on my grey coat early in the morning." Though the two veterans were to march to the cemetery, carriages were provided to bring them home. Fosterville meant to be as careful as possible of its treasures. "I don't need any carriage to ride in, like Ed Green," said Adam proudly. "I could march out and back. Perhaps Ed Green will have to ride out as well as back." But Edward Green neither rode nor walked. The day turned suddenly warm. The heat and excitement accelerated his already rapid breathing, and the doctor forbade his setting foot to the ground. "But I will," cried Edward, in whom the spirit of war still lived. "No," said the doctor. "Then I will ride." "You will stay in bed," said the doctor. So without Edward Green, the parade was formed. Before the courthouse waited the band, and the long line of school children, and the burgess, and the fire company, and the distinguished stranger who was to make the address, until Henry Faust appeared, in his blue suit, with his flag on his breast and his bouquet in his hand. On each side of him walked a tall, middle-aged son who seemed to hand him over reluctantly to the marshal, who was to escort him to his place. Smilingly he spoke to the marshal, but he was the only one who smiled or spoke. For an instant men and women broke off in the middle of their sentences, a husky something in their throats. Children looked up at him with awe. Even his own grandchildren did not dare to wave or call from their places in the ranks. Then the storm of cheers broke. Round the next corner Adam Faust waited. He was clad in his grey uniform. Those who looked at him closely saw with astonishment that it was a new uniform. His brows met in a frown. His grey moustache seemed to bristle. "How he hates them," said one citizen of Fosterville to another. "Just look at poor Adam. Used to bait his hook for him," Adam was saying. "Used to carry him pickaback. Used to go halves with him on everything. Now he walks with Ed Green." Adam pressed forward to the curb. The band was playing "Marching Through Georgia," which he hated. Everybody was cheering. The volume of sound was deafening. "Cheering Ed Green," said Adam. "Fat, lazy, didn't have a wound. Dare say he hid behind a tree. Dare say." The band was in sight now. The back of the drum major appeared. Then all the musicians swung round the corner. After them came the little children with their flowers and their shining faces. "Him and Ed Green next," said old Adam. But Henry walked alone. Adam's whole body jerked in his astonishment. He heard someone say that Ed Green was sick, that the doctor had forbidden him to march or even to ride. As he pressed nearer the curb, he heard the admiring comments of the crowd. "Isn't he magnificent? See his beautiful flowers. His grandchildren always sent him flowers. He's our first citizen." "He's mine!" Adam wanted to cry out. "He's mine!" Never had Adam felt so miserable, so jealous, so heartsick. His eyes were filled with the great figure. Henry was, in truth, magnificent, not only in himself, but in what he represented. He seemed symbolic of a great era of the past, and at the same time of a new age which was advancing. Old Adam understood all his glory. "He's mine," said old Adam again, foolishly. Then Adam leaned forward with startled, staring eyes. Henry had bowed and smiled in answer to the cheers. Across the street, his own house was a mass of color. Red, white, and blue over windows and doors. Gay dresses on the porch. On each side the pavement was crowded with a shouting multitude. Surely no hero had ever had a more glorious passage through the streets of his birthplace. But old Adam saw that Henry's face blanched, that there appeared suddenly upon it an expression of intolerable pain. For an instant Henry's step faltered and grew uncertain. Then old Adam began to behave like a wild man. He pushed himself through the crowd. He flung himself upon the rope as though to tear it down. He called out, "Wait! Wait!" Frightened women, fearful of some sinister purpose, tried to grasp and hold him. No man was immediately at hand, or Adam would have been seized and taken away. As for the feeble women, Adam shook them off and laughed at them. "Let me go, you geese," said he. A mounted marshal saw him and rode down upon him. Men started from under the ropes to pursue him, but Adam eluded them or outdistanced them. He strode across an open space with a surety which gave no hint of the terrible beating of his heart until he reached the side of Henry. Him he greeted, breathlessly and with terrible eagerness. "Henry," said he, gasping. "Henry, do you want me to walk along?" Henry saw the alarmed crowds. He saw the marshal's hand stretched to seize Adam. He saw most clearly of all the tearful eyes under the beetling brows. Henry's voice shook, but he made himself clear. "It's all right," said he to the marshal. "Let him be." "I saw you were alone," said Adam. "I said, Henry needs me. I know what it is to be alone. But Adam did not finish his sentence. He found a hand on his, a blue arm linked tightly in his grey arm. He felt himself moved along amid thunderous roars of sound. "Of course I need you," said Henry. "I've needed you all along." Then, old but young, their lives almost ended, but themselves immortal, united, to be divided no more, amid an ever-thickening sound of cheers, the two marched down the street. End of section 22.
Section 23 of the Best Short Stories of 1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lisa Murphy. The Yellow Cat by Wilbur Daniel Steele, from Harper's Magazine. Copyright 1915 by Harper & Brothers. Copyright 1916 by Wilbur Daniel Steele. At least once in my life I have had the good fortune to board a deserted vessel at sea. I say good fortune because it has left me the memory of a singular impression. I have felt a ghost of the same thing 2 or 3 times since then, when peeping through the doorway of an abandoned house. Now, that vessel was not dead. She was a good vessel, a sound vessel, even a handsome vessel, in her blunt-bowed, coastwise way. She sailed under 4 lowers across as blue and glittering a sea as I have ever known, and there was not a point in her sailing that one could lay a finger upon as wrong. And yet, passing that schooner at 2 miles, one knew, somehow, that no hand was on her wheel. Sometimes I can imagine a vessel, stricken like that, moving over the empty spaces of the sea, carrying it off quite well, were it not for that indefinable suggestion of a stagger. And I can think of all those ocean gods in whom no landsman will ever believe, looking at one another and tapping their foreheads with just the shadow of a smile. I wonder if they all scream, these ships that have lost their souls. Mine screamed. We heard her voice, like nothing I have ever heard before, when we rode under her counter to read her name. The Marionette it was, of Halifax. I remember how it made me shiver, there in the full blaze of the sun, to hear her going on so, railing and screaming in that stark fashion. And I remember, too, how our footsteps, pattering through the vacant internals in search of that haggard utterance, made me think of the footsteps of hurrying warders roused in the night. And we found a parrot in a cage, that was all. It wanted water. We gave it water and went away to look things over, keeping pretty close together, all of us. In the quarters the table was set for 4. 2 men had begun to eat, by the evidence of the plates. Nowhere in the vessel was there any sign of disorder, except one sea-chest broken out, evidently in haste. Her papers were gone, and the stern davits were empty. That is how the case stood that day, and that is how it has stood to this. I saw this same Marionette a week later, tied up to a Hoboken dock, where she awaited news from her owners. But even there, in the midst of all the waterfront bustle, I could not get rid of the feeling that she was still very far away, in a sort of shippish other world. The thing happens now and then. Sometimes half a dozen years will go by without a solitary wanderer of this sort crossing the ocean paths. And then, in a single season, perhaps several of them will turn up. Vacant waifs, impassive and mysterious, a quarter column of tidings tucked away on the second page of the evening paper. That is where I read the story about the Abbey Rose. I recollect how painfully awkward and out of place it looked there, cramped between ruled black edges and smelling of landsman's ink. This thing that had to do essentially with air and vast colored spaces. I forget the exact words of the heading, something like "Abandoned Craft Picked Up at Sea," but I still have the clipping itself, couched in the formal patter of the marine news writer. The first hint of another mystery of the sea came in today when the schooner Abbey Rose dropped anchor in the upper river, manned only by a crew of 1. It appeared that the outbound freighter Mercury sighted the Abbey Rose off Block Island on Thursday last, acting in a suspicious manner. A boat party sent aboard found the schooner in perfect order and condition, sailing under 4 lower sails, the topsails being pursed up to the mastheads but not stowed. With the exception of a yellow cat, the vessel was found to be utterly deserted, though her small boat still hung in the davits. No evidences of disorder were visible in any part of the craft. The dishes were washed up, the stove in the galley was still slightly warm to the touch, everything in its proper place, with the exception of the vessel's papers, which were not to be found. All indications being for fair weather, Captain Romer of the Mercury detailed 2 of his company to bring the find back to this port, a distance of 115 miles. The only man available with the knowledge of the fore and aft rig was Stuart McCord, the second engineer. A seaman by the name of Bjornson was sent with him. McCord arrived this noon, after a very heavy voyage of 5 days, reporting that Bjornson had fallen overboard while shaking out the fore topsail. McCord himself showed evidences of the hardships he has passed through, being almost a nervous wreck. Stuart McCord! Yes, Stuart McCord would have a knowledge of the fore and aft rig, or of almost anything else connected with the affairs of the sea. It happened that I used to know this fellow. I had even been quite chummy with him in the old days, that is, to the extent of drinking too many beers with him in certain hot country ports. I remembered him as a stolid and deliberate sort of person, with an amazing hodgepodge of learning, a stamp collection, and a theory about the effects of tropical sunshine on the Caucasian race, to which I have listened half of more than one night, stretched out naked on a freighter's deck. He had not impressed me as a fellow who would be bothered by his nerves. And there was another thing about the story which struck me as rather queer. Perhaps it is a relic of my seafaring days, but I have always been a conscientious reader of the weather reports, and I could remember no weather in the past week sufficient to shake a man out of a top, especially a man by the name of Bjornson, a thoroughgoing seafaring name. I was destined to hear more of this in the evening from the ancient boatman who rowed me out on the upper river. He had been to sea in his day. He knew enough to wonder about this thing, even to indulge in a little superstitious awe about it. No sirree, something happened to them 4 chaps, and another thing. I fancied I heard a seabird whining in the darkness overhead. A shape moved out of the gloom ahead, passed to the left, lofty and silent, and merged once more with the gloom behind, a barge at anchor, with the sea-grass clinging around her waterline. Funny about that other chap, the old fellow speculated. Bjornson, I believe he called him. Now, that story sounds to me kind of... He feathered his oars with a suspicious jerk and peered at me. This McCord a friend of yours? He inquired. In a way, I said. Well... He turned on his thwart to squint ahead. There she is, he announced, with something of relief, I thought. It was hard at that time of night to make anything but a black blotch out of the Abbey Rose. Of course, I could see that she was pot-bellied, like the rest of the coastwise sisterhood. and that McCord had not stowed his topsails. I could make them out, perched at the mastheads and hanging down as far as the cross-trees, like huge, overripe pears. Then I recollected that he had found them so, probably had not touched them since. A queer way to leave tops, it seemed to me. I could see also the glowing tip of a cigar floating restlessly along the farther rail. I called, "McCord! Oh, McCord!" The spark came swimming across the deck. Hello there. There was a note of querulous uneasiness there that somehow jarred with my remembrance of this man. "Ridgway," I explained. He echoed the name uncertainly, still with that suggestion of peevishness hanging over the rail and peering down at us. "Oh, by gracious," he exclaimed abruptly. "I'm glad to see you, Ridgway. I had a boatman coming out before this, but I guess he'll be along. By gracious, I'm glad." "I'll not keep you," I told the gnome, putting the money in his palm and reaching for the rail. McCord lent me a hand on my wrist. Then, when I stood squarely on the deck beside him, he appeared to forget my presence, leaned forward heavily on the rail, and squinted after my waning boatman. "Ahoy, boat!" he called out, sharply shielding his lips with his hands. His violence seemed to bring him out of the blank, for he fell immediately to puffing strongly at his cigar, and explaining in rather a shame-voiced way that he was beginning to think his own boatman had passed him up. "Come in and have a nip," he urged with an abrupt heartiness, clapping me on the shoulder. I did not say what I had intended. I was thinking that in the old days McCord had made rather a fetish of touching nothing stronger than beer. Neither had he been of the shoulder-clapping sort. "So you've got something aboard?" I shifted. "Dead men's liquor," he chuckled. It gave me a queer feeling in the pit of my stomach to hear him. I began to wish I had not come, but there was nothing for it now but to follow him into the after-house. The cabin itself might have been 9 feet square, with 3 bunks occupying the port side. To the right opened the master's stateroom, and a door in the forward bulkhead led to the galley. I took in these features at a casual glance. Then, hardly knowing why I did it, I began to examine them with greater care. "Have you a match?" I asked. My voice sounded very small, as though something unheard of had happened to all the air. "Smoke?" he asked. "I'll get you a cigar." "No." I took the preferred match, scratched it on the side of the galley door, and passed out. There seemed to be 1,000 pans there, throwing my match back at me from every wall of the box-like compartment. Even McCord's eyes in the doorway were large and round and shining. He probably thought me crazy. Perhaps I was, a little. I ran the match along close to the ceiling and came upon a rusty hook a little aport of the center. "There," I said. "Was there anything hanging from this, say, a parrot or something, McCord?" The match burned my fingers and went out. "What do you mean?" McCord demanded from the doorway. I got myself back into the comfortable yellow glow of the cabin before I answered, and then it was a question. "Do you happen to know anything about this craft's personal history?" "No. What are you talking about? Why?" "Well, I do," I offered. "For one thing, she's changed her name. And it happens this isn't the first time damn it all, 14 years ago, I helped pick up this whatever she is off the Virginia Capes, in the same sort of condition. There you are." I was yapping like a nerve-strung puppy. McCord leaned forward with his hands on the table, bringing his face beneath the fan of the hanging lamp. For the first time I could mark how shockingly it had changed. It was almost colorless. The jaw had somehow lost its old-time security, and the eyes seemed to be loose in their sockets. I had expected him to start at my announcement. He only blinked at the light. "I'm not surprised," he remarked at length, "after what I've seen and heard." He lifted his fist and brought it down with a sudden crash on the table. "Man, let's have a nip." He was off before I could say a word, fumbling out of sight in the narrow stateroom. Presently he reappeared, holding a glass in either hand and a dark bottle hugged between his elbows. Putting the glasses down, he held up the bottle between his eyes and the lamp, and its shadow falling across his face, green and luminous at the core, gave him a ghastly look, like a mutilation or an unspeakable birthmark. He shook the bottle gently and chuckled his dead men's liquor again. Then he poured 2 half-glasses of the clear gin, swallowed his portion, and sat down. "A parrot," he mused, a little of the liquor's color creeping into his cheeks. "No, this time it was a cat, Ridgway. A yellow cat. She was—" "Was?" I caught him up. "What's happened? What's become of her?" "Vanished. Evaporated. I haven't seen her since night before last, when I caught her trying to lower the boat." "Stop it." It was I who banged the table now, without any reserve of decency. "McCord, you're drunk. Drunk, I tell you. A cat. Let a cat throw you off your head like this? She's probably hiding out below this minute, on affairs of her own." "Hiding?" He regarded me for a moment with the queer superiority of the damned. "I guess you don't realize how many times I've been over this hulk, from decks to keelson, with a mallet and a foot rule." "Or fallen overboard," I shifted with less assurance, "like this fellow Bjornson. By the way, McCord—" I stopped there on account of the look in his eyes. He reached out, poured himself a shot, swallowed it, and got up to shuffle about the confined quarters. I watched their restless circuit, my friend and his jumping shadow. He stopped and bent forward to examine a Sunday supplement chromo tacked on the wall, and the 2 heads drew together, as though there was something to whisper. Of a sudden I seemed to hear the old gnome croaking. "Now that story sounds to me kind of—" McCord straightened up and turned to face me. "What do you know about Bjornson?" he demanded. "Well, only what they had you saying in the papers," I told him. "Pshaw!" He snapped his fingers, tossing the affair aside. "I found her log," he announced in quite another voice. "You did, eh?" I judged from what I read in the paper that there wasn't a sign. No. I happened on this the other night, under the mattress in there." He jerked his head toward the stateroom. "Wait." I heard him knocking things over in the dark and mumbling at them. After a moment he came out and threw on the table a long, cloth-covered ledger of the common commercial sort. It lay open at about the middle, showing close script running indiscriminately across the column ruling. "When I said log," he went on, "I guess I was going it a little strong. At least, I wouldn't want that sort of log found around my vessel. Let's call it a personal record. Here's his picture, somewhere." He shook the book by its back, and a common Kodak blueprint fluttered to the table. It was the likeness of a solid man with a paunch, a huge square beard, small squinting eyes, and a bald head. "What do you make of him? A writing chap?" "From the nose down, yes," I estimated. "From the nose up, he will tend to his own business if you will tend to yours strictly." McCord slapped his thigh. "By gracious, that's the fellow. He hates the Chinaman. He knows as well as anything he ought not to put in black and white how intolerably he hates the Chinaman. And yet he must sneak off to his cubbyhole and suck his pencil. And how is it Stevenson has it? The agony of composition, you remember. Can you imagine the fellow, Ridgway, bundling down here with the fever on him?" "About the Chinaman," I broke in. "I think you said something about a Chinaman?" "Yes, the cook, he must have been. I gather he wasn't the master's pick, by the reading matter here. Probably clapped on to him by the owners, shifted from one of their others at the last moment. A queer trick. Listen." He picked up the book, and running over the pages with a selective thumb read, "August 2nd, first part, moderately southwesterly breeze," and so forth. But here comes to it. "Anything can happen to a man at sea, even a funeral. In special to a Chinaman who is of no account to social welfare, being a barbarian as I look at it." Something of a philosopher, you see. And did you get the reserve in that even a funeral? An artist, I tell you. But wait, let me catch him a bit wilder. Here. "I'll get that mustard-colored—" This is back a couple of days. Never can hear. The coming in them carpet slippers. Turned around and found him standing right to my back this morning. Could have stuck a knife into me easy. "Look here," says I, and fetched him a tap on the air that will make him walk louder next time, I warrant. He could have stuck a knife into me easy. A clear case of moral funk, I should say. Can you imagine the fellow, Ridgway? Yes, oh yes, I was ready with a phrase of my own. A man handicapped with an imagination. You see, he can't quite understand this barbarian who has him beaten by about 30 centuries of civilization, and his imagination has to have something to chew on, something to hit. A tap on the ear, you know. By gracious, that's the ticket, McCord pounded his knee. And now we've got another chap going to pieces. Peters, he calls him. Refuses to eat dinner on August the 3rd, claiming he caught the chink making passes over the chowder pot with his thumb. Can you believe it, Ridgway? In this very cabin here? Then he went on with a suggestion of haste, as though he had somehow made a slip. Well, at any rate, the disease seems to be catching. Next day it's Bach, the second seaman, who begins to feel the gaff. Listen. Back he comes to me tonight, complaining he's being watched. He claims has got the evil eye. Says he can see you through a 2-inch bulkhead and the like. The chinks laying in his bunk turned the other way. Why don't you go aboard of him, says I. The Dutcher says nothing, but goes over to his own bunk and feels under the straw. When he comes back, he's looking queer. By God, says he, the devil has swiped my gun. Now, if that's true, there's going to be hell to pay in this vessel very quick. I figure I'm still master of this vessel. The evil eye, I grunted. Conscience has gone wrong there somewhere. Not altogether, Ridgway. I can see that yellow man peeking. Now, just figure yourself, say 8,000 miles from home, out on the water alone, with a crowd of heathen fanatics crazy from fright, looking around for guns and so on. Don't you believe you'd keep an eye around the corners, kinda, eh? I'll bet a hat he was taking it all in, lying there in his bunk, turned the other way. Eh, I pity the poor cuss. Well, there's only one more entry after that. He's good and mad. Here. Now, by God, this is the end. My gun's gone too, right out from under lock and key, by God. I've been talking with Bach this morning. Not to let on, I had him in to clean my lamp. There's more ways than one, he says, and so do I. McCord closed the book and dropped it on the table. Fini, he said. The rest is blank paper. Well, I will confess I felt much better than I had for some time past. There's one mystery of the sea gone to pot, at any rate. And now, if you don't mind, I'll have another of your nips, McCord. He pushed my glass across the table and got up, and behind his back his shoulder rose to scour the corners of the room, like an incorruptible sentinel. I forgot to take up my gin, watching him. After an uneasy minute or so, he came back to the table and pressed the tip of a forefinger on the book. Ridgway, he said, you don't seem to understand. This particular mystery of the sea hasn't been scratched yet. Not even scratched, Ridgway. He sat down and leaned forward, fixing me with a didactic finger. What happened? Well, I have an idea the barbarian got them when it came to the pinch. And let the remains over the side? I should say. And then they came back and got the barbarian and let him over the side, eh? There were none left, you remember? Oh, good Lord, I don't know. I flared with the childish resentment at this catechizing of his. But his finger remained there, challenging. I do, he announced. The Chinaman put them over the side, as we have said. And then, after that, he died of wounds about the head. So, I had still sarcasm. You will remember, he went on, that the skipper did not happen to mention a cat, a yellow cat, in his confessions. McCord, I begged him, please drop it. Why in thunder should he mention a cat? True. Why should he mention a cat? I think one of the reasons why he should not mention a cat is because there did not happen to be a cat aboard at the time. Oh, all right. I reached out and pulled the bottle to my side of the table. Then I took out my watch. If you don't mind, I suggested, I think we'd better be going ashore. I've got to get to my office rather early in the morning. What do you say? He said nothing for the moment, but his finger had dropped. He leaned back and stared straight into the core of the light above, his eyes squinting. He would have been from the south of China, probably. He seemed to be talking to himself. There's a considerable sprinkling of the belief down there, I've heard. It's an uncanny business, this transmigration of souls. Personally, I had had enough of it. McCord's fingers came groping across the table for the bottle. I picked it up hastily and let it go through the open companionway, where it died with a faint gurgle, out somewhere on the river. Now, I said to him, shaking the vagrant wrist, either you come ashore with me, or you go in there and get under the blankets. You're drunk, McCord, drunk. Do you hear me? Ridgway, he pronounced, bringing his eyes down to me and speaking very slowly. You're a fool if you can't see better than that. I'm not drunk. I'm sick. I haven't slept for 3 nights, and now I can't. And you say you... He went to pieces very suddenly, jumped up, pounded the legs of his chair on the decking, and shouted at me. And you say that you landlubber, you office coddler, you're so comfortably sure that everything in the world is cut and dried. Come back to the water again and learn how to wonder, and stop talking like a damn fool. Do you know where... Is there anything in your municipal budget to tell me where Bjornson went? Listen, he sat down, waving me to do the same, and went on with a sort of desperate repression. It happened on the first night after we took this hellion. I'd stood the wheel most of the afternoon, off and on, that is, because she sails herself uncommonly well. Just put her on a reach, you know, and she carries it off pretty well. I know, I nodded. Well, we mugged up about 7 o'clock. There was a good deal of canned stuff in the galley, and Bjornson wasn't a bad hand with the kettle. A thoroughgoing squarehead he was, tall and lean and yellow-haired, with little fat, round cheeks, and a white mustache. Not a bad chap at all. He took the wheel to stand till midnight, and I turned in, but I didn't drop off for quite a spell. I could hear his boots wandering around over my head, padding off forward, coming back again. I heard him whistling now and then, an outlandish air. Occasionally, I could see the shadow of his head waving in a block of moonlight that lay on the decking right down there in front of the stateroom door. It came from the companion. The cabin was dark because we were going easy on the oil. They hadn't left a great deal for some reason or other. McCord leaned back and described with his finger where the illumination had cut the decking. There. I could see it from my bunk as I lay, you understand. I must have almost dropped off once when I heard him fiddling round out here in the cabin, and then he said something in a whisper, just to find out if I was still awake, I suppose. I asked him what the matter was. He came and poked his head in the door. The breeze is going out, says he. I was wondering if we couldn't get a little more sail on her. Only I can't give you his fierce square-head tang. How about the tops, he suggested. I was so sleepy I didn't care, and I told him so. All right, he says, but I thought I might shake out one of them tops. Then I heard him blow at something outside. Scat, you! Then, this cat's going to set me crazy, Mr. McCord, he says, following me around everywhere. He gave a kick, and I saw something yellow floating across the moonlight. It never made a sound, just floated. You wouldn't have known it ever lit anywhere, just like... McCord stopped and drummed a few beats on the table with his fist, as though to bring himself back to the straight narrative. I went to sleep, he began again. I dreamed about a lot of things. I woke up sweating. You know how glad you are to wake up after a dream like that, and you find none of it is so? Well, I turned over and settled to go off again. And then I got a little more awake and thought to myself it must be pretty near time for me to go on deck. I scratched a match and looked at my watch. That fellow must be either a good chap or asleep, I said to myself, and I rolled out quick and went above decks. He wasn't at the wheel. I called him, Bjornson, Bjornson. No answer. McCord was really telling a story now. He paused for a long moment, one hand shielding an ear, and his eyeballs turned far up. That was the first time I really went over the hulk, he ran on. I got out a lantern and started at the forward end of the hold, and I worked aft, and there was nothing there. Not a sign or a stain or a scrap of clothing or anything. You may believe that I began to feel funny inside. I went over the decks and the rails and the house itself, inch by inch. Not a trace. I went out aft again. The cat sat on the wheel box, washing her face. I hadn't noticed the scar on her head before, running down between her ears. Rather a new scar, 3 or 4 days old, I should say. It looked ghastly and blue-white in the flat moonlight. I ran over and grabbed her up to heave her over the side. You understand how upset I was. Now, you know a cat will squirm around and grab something when you hold it like that, generally speaking. This one didn't. She just drooped and began to purr and looked up at me out of her moonlit eyes under that scar. I dropped her on the deck and backed off. You remember Bjornson had kicked her, and I didn't want anything like that happening to... The narrator turned upon me with a sudden heat, leaned over and shook his finger before my face. "There you go," he cried. "You with your stout stone buildings and your policemen and your neighborhood church. You're so damn sure. But I just like to see you out there, alone with the moon setting and all the lights gone tall and queer, and a shipmate..." He lifted his hand overhead, the fingertips pressed together, and then suddenly separated as though he had released an impalpable something into the air. "Go on," I told him. I felt more like you do when it got light again and warm and sunshiny. I said bah to the whole business. I even fed the cat, and I slept a while on the roof of the house. I was so sure. We lay dead most of the day, without a streak of air. But that night, that night I hadn't got over being sure yet. It takes quite a jolt, you know, to shake loose several dozen generations. A fair, steady breeze had come along. The glass was high, she was staying herself like a doll, and so I figured I could get a little rest lying below in the bunk, even if I didn't sleep. I tried not to sleep, in case something should come up, a squall or the like. But I think I must have dropped off once or twice. I remember I heard something fiddling around in the galley, and I hollered, "Scat!" and everything was quiet again. I rolled over and lay on my left side, staring at that square of moonlight outside my door for a long time. You'll think it was a dream, what I saw there. "Go on," I said. "Call this tabletop the spot of light, roughly," he said. He placed a fingertip at about the middle of the forward edge and drew it slowly toward the center. Here, what would correspond with the upper side of the companionway, there came down very gradually the shadow of a tail. I watched it streaking out there across the deck, wiggling the slightest bit now and then. When it had come down about halfway across the light, the solid part of the animal, its shadow, you understand, began to appear, quite big and round. But how could she hang there, done up in a ball from the hatch? He shifted his finger back to the edge of the table and puddled it around to signify the shadowed body. I fished my gun out from behind my back. You see, I was feeling funny again. Then I started to slide 1 foot over the edge of the bunk, always with my eyes on that shadow. Now I swear I didn't make the sound of a pin dropping, but I had no more than moved a muscle when that shadowed thing twisted itself around in a flash, and there on the floor before me was the profile of a man's head, upside down, listening, a man's head with a tail of hair. McCord got up hastily and stepped in front of the stateroom door, where he bent down and scratched a match. "See," he said, holding the tiny flame above a splintered scar on the boards. "You wouldn't think a man would be fool enough to shoot at a shadow." He came back and sat down. "It seemed to me all hell had shaken loose. You've no idea, Ridgway, the rumpus a gun raises in a box like this. I found out afterward the slug ricocheted into the galley, bringing down a couple of pans, and that helped. Oh, yes, I got out of here quick enough. I stood there, half out of the companion, with my hands on the hatch and the gun between them, and my shadow running off across the top of the house, shivering before my eyes like a dry leaf. There wasn't a whisper of sound in the world, just the pale water floating past, and the sails towering up like a pair of twittering ghosts. And everything that crazy color. Well, in a minute I saw it, just abreast of the mainmast, crouched down in the shadow of the weather rail, sneaking off forward very slowly. This time I took a good long sight before I let go. Did you ever happen to see black powder smoke in the moonlight? It puffed out perfectly round, like a big pale balloon, this did, and for a second something was bounding through it. Without a sound, you understand. something a shade solider than the smoke, and big as a cow it looked to me. It passed from the weather side to the lee and ducked behind the sweep of the mainsail like that. McCord snapped his thumb and forefinger under the light. Go on, I said. What did you do then? McCord regarded me for an instant from beneath his lids, uncertain. His fist hung above the table. He hesitated, his lips working vacantly. A forefinger came out of the fist and gesticulated before my face. If you're laughing, why, damn me, I'll... Go on, I repeated. What did you do then? I followed the thing. He was still watching me sullenly. I got up and went forward along the roof of the house, so as to have an eye on either rail. You understand, this business had to be done with. I kept straight along. Every shadow I wasn't absolutely sure of, I made sure of point blank. And I rounded the thing up at the very stem, sitting on the butt of the bowsprit, Ridgway, washing her yellow face under the moon. I didn't make any bones about it this time. I put the bad end of that gun against the scar on her head and squeezed the trigger. It snicked on an empty shell. I tell you a fact, I was almost deafened by the report that didn't come. She followed me aft. I couldn't get away from her. I went and sat on the wheel box, and she came and sat on the edge of the house, facing me. And there we stayed for upwards of an hour, without moving. Finally, she went over and stuck her paw in the water pan I'd set out for her. Then she raised her head and looked at me and yawled. At sundown, there'd been 2 quarts of water in that pan. You wouldn't think a cat could get away with 2 quarts of water in... He broke off again and considered me with a sort of weary defiance. What's the use? He spread out his hands in a gesture of hopelessness. I knew you wouldn't believe it when I started. You couldn't. It would be a kind of blasphemy against the sacred institution of pavements. You're too damn smug, Ridgway. I can't shake you. You haven't sat 2 days and 2 nights, keeping your eyes open by sheer teeth-gritting, until they got used to it and wouldn't shut any more. When I tell you I found that yellow thing snooping around the davits and 3 bites off the boat fall loosened out, plain on deck, you grin behind your collar. When I tell you she padded off forward and evaporated, flickered back to hell and hasn't been seen since, then, why, you explain to yourself that I'm drunk. I tell you... He jerked his head back abruptly and turned to face the companionway, his lips still apart. He listened so for a moment. Then he shook himself out of it and went on. I tell you, Ridgway, I've been over this hulk with a foot rule. There's not a cubic inch I haven't accounted for, not a plank This time he got up and moved a step toward the companion, where he stood with his head bent forward and slightly to the side. After what might have been 20 seconds of this, he whispered, Do you hear? Far and far away down the reach, a ferry boat lifted its infinitesimal wail, and then the silence of the night river came down once more, profound and inscrutable. A corner of the wick above my head sputtered a little. That was all. Hear what? I whispered back. He lifted a cautious finger toward the opening. Somebody. Listen. The man's faculties must have been keyed up to the pitch of his nerves, for to me the night remained as voiceless as a subterranean cavern. I became intensely irritated with him. Within my mind I cried out against this infatuated pantomime of his. And then, of a sudden, there was a sound, the dying rumor of a ripple, somewhere in the outside darkness, as though an object had been let into the water with extreme care. You heard. I nodded. The ticking of the watch in my vest pocket came to my ears, shucking off the leisurely seconds, while McCord's fingernails gnawed at the palms of his hands. The man was really sick. He wheeled on me and cried out, My God, Ridgway, why don't we go out? I, for one, refused to be a fool. I passed him and climbed out of the opening. He followed far enough to lean his elbows on the hatch, his feet and legs still within the secure glow of the cabin. You see, there's nothing. My wave of assurance was possibly a little overdone. Over there, he muttered, jerking his head toward the shore lights. Something swimming. I moved to the corner of the house and listened. River thieves, I argued. The place is full of... Ridgway, look behind you. Perhaps it is the pavements, but no matter. I am not ordinarily a jumping sort. And yet there was something in the quality of that voice beyond my shoulder that brought the sweat stinging through the pores of my scalp, even while I was in the act of turning. A cat sat there on the hatch, expressionless and immobile in the gloom. I did not say anything. I turned and went below. McCord was there already, standing on the farther side of the table. After a moment or so, the cat followed and sat on her haunches at the foot of the ladder and stared at us without winking. I think she wants something to eat, I said to McCord. He lit a lantern and went into the galley. Returning with a chunk of salt beef, he threw it into the farther corner. The cat went over and began to tear at it, her muscles playing with convulsive shadow lines under the sagging yellow hide. And now it was she who listened to something beyond the reach of even McCord's faculties, her neck stiff and her ears flattened. I looked at McCord and found him brooding at the animal with a sort of listless malevolence. "Quick! She has kittens somewhere about." I shook his elbow sharply. "When she starts, now—" "You don't seem to understand," he mumbled. "It wouldn't be any use." She had turned now and was making for the ladder with the soundless agility of a race. I grasped McCord's wrist and dragged him after me, the lantern banging against his knees. When we came up, the cat was already amidships, a scarcely discernible shadow at the margin of our lantern's ring. She stopped and looked back at us with her luminous eyes, appeared to hesitate, uneasy at our pursuit of her, shifted here and there with quick, soft bounds, and stopped to fawn with her back arched at the foot of the mast. Then she was off with an amazing suddenness into the shadows forward. "Lively now," I yelled at McCord. He came pounding along behind me, still protesting that it was of no use. Abreast of the foremast, I took the lantern from him to hold above my head. "You see," he complained, peering here and there over the illuminated deck. "I tell you, Ridgway, this thing—" But my eyes were in another quarter, and I slapped him on the shoulder. An engineer to the core," I cried at him. "Look aloft, man!" Our quarry was almost to the cross-trees, clambering the shrouds with a smartness no sailor has ever come to, her yellow body cut by the moving shadows of the ratlines, a queer sight against the mat of the night. McCord closed his mouth and opened it again for 2 words. "By gracious!" The following instant he had the lantern and was after her. I watched him go up above my head, a ponderous, swaying climber into the sky, come to the cross-trees, and squat there with his knees clamped around the mast. The clear star of the lantern shot this way and that for a moment. Then it disappeared, and in its place there sprang out a bag of yellow light, like a fire balloon at anchor in the heavens. I could see the shadows of his head and hands moving monstrously over the inner surface of the sail, and muffled exclamations without meaning came down to me. After a moment he drew out his head and called, "All right, they're here! Heads! They're below!" I ducked at his warning, and something spanked on the planking a yard from my feet. I stepped over to the vague blur on the deck and picked up a slipper covered with some woven straw stuff and soled with a matted felt, perhaps a half-inch thick. Another struck somewhere about the mast, and then McCord reappeared above and began to stagger down the shrouds. Under his left arm he hugged a curious assortment of litter, a sheaf of papers, a brace of revolvers, a gray kimono, and a soiled apron. "Well," he said when he had come to deck, "I feel like a man who has gone to hell and come back again. You know I'd come to the place where I really believe that about the cat. When you think of it, by gracious, we haven't come so far from the jungle after all." We went aft and below and sat down at the table as we had been. McCord broke a prolonged silence. "I'm sort of glad he got away, poor cuss. He's probably climbing up a wharf this minute, shivering and scared to death. Over toward the gas tanks, by the way, he was swimming. By gracious, now that the world's turned over straight again, I feel I could sleep a solid week. Poor cuss, can you imagine him, Ridgway?" "Yes," I broke in, "I think I can. He must have lost his nerve when he made out your smoke and shinnied up there to stow away, taking the ship's papers with him. He would have attached some profound importance to them. Remember, the barbarian, 8,000 miles from home, probably couldn't read a word. I suppose the cat followed him. the traditional source of food. He must have wanted water badly. I should say, he wouldn't have taken the chances he did. Well, I announced, at any rate, I can say it now. There's another mystery of the sea gone to pot. McCord lifted his heavy lids. No, he mumbled. The mystery is that a man who has been to sea all his life could sail around for 3 days with a man bundled up in his top and not know it. When I think of him peeking down at me and playing off that damn cat, probably without realizing it, scared to death, by gracious. Ridgway, there was a pair of funks aboard this craft, huh? Wow. Yow, I could sleep. I think you should. McCord did not answer. By the way, I speculated, I guess you were right about Bjornson, McCord. That is, his fooling with the foretop. He must have been caught all of a bunch, eh? Again, McCord failed to answer. I looked up, mildly surprised, and found his head hanging back over his chair and his mouth opened wide. He was asleep. End of section 23.
Section 24 of the Best Short Stories of 1915. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Freeland. The Bounty Jumper by Mary Synon, from Scribner's Magazine. While faith, that in the mire was fain to wallow, returns at last to find the cold fanes desolate, the niches hollow, the windows dim and blind, and strewn with ruins around the shattered relic of unregardful youth, where shapes of beauty once, with tongues angelic, whispered the runes of truth. From The Burden of Lost Souls. On the day before Isidore Framberg's body was brought back to Chicago from Vera Cruz, James Thorold's appointment as ambassador to Forsland was confirmed by the Senate of the United States. Living, Isidore Framberg might never have wedged into the affairs of nations and the destinies of James Thorold. Marines in the Navy do not intrigue with chances of knee breeches at the court of St. Jerome. More than miles lie between Fourgear Street and the Lake Shore Drive. Dead, Isidore Framberg became, as dead men sometimes become, the archangel of a nation, standing with flaming sword at the gateway to James Thorold's paradise. For 10 years, the Forsland Embassy had been the goal of James Thorold's ambition. A man past 70, head of a great importing establishment, he had shown interest in public affairs only within the decade, although his very build, tall, erect, commanding, and his manner, suavely courteous and untouched by feudal haste, seemed to have equipped him with a natural bent for public life. Marrying late in life, he seemed to have found his bent more tardily than did other men. But he had invested wealth, influence, and wisdom in the future of men who, come to power, were paying him with this grant of his desire. The news, coming to him unofficially but authoritatively from Washington, set him to cabling his wife and daughter in Paris and telegraphing his son, whose steamer was just docking in New York. The boy's answer, delayed in transit and announcing that he was already on his way to Chicago, came with the morning newspapers and hurried his father through their contents in order that he might be on time to meet Peter at the station. The newspapers, chronicling Thorold's appointment briefly, were heavy with harbingering of the funeral procession of the boy who had fallen a fortnight before in the American Navy's attack upon Vera Cruz. The relative values that editors placed upon the Marine's death and his own honoring nettled Thorold. Ambassadors to the court of St. Jerome were not chosen from Chicago every day, he reasoned, finding Isidore Framberg already the fly in the amber of his contentment. To change the current of his thought, he read over Peter's telegram, smiling at the exuberant message of joy in which the boy had vaunted the family glory. The yellow slip drove home to James Thorold the realization of how largely Peter's young enthusiasm was responsible for the whetting of his father's desire to take part in public affairs. For Peter's praise, James Thorold would have moved mountains, and Peter's praise had a way of following the man on horseback. Thorold's eager anticipation of the boy's pride in him sped his course through rosy mists of hope as his motor car threaded the bright drive and through the crowded parkway toward the Rush Street Bridge. Cloud drifted across the sky of his serenity, however, as a blockade of traffic delayed his car in front of the old Adams homestead, rising among lilacs that flooded half City Square with fragrance. The old house, famous beyond its own day for Judge Adams' friendship with Abraham Lincoln, and the history-making sessions that the little group of Illinois idealists had held within its walls, loomed gray above the flowering shrubs, a saddening reminder of days that James Thorold must have known. But Thorold, glimpsing the place, turned away from it in a movement so swift as to betoken some resentment, and gave heed instead to the long line of motors rolling smoothly toward the city's heart. Over the bridge and through the packed streets of the downtown district, Thorold, shaken from his reverie of power, and Peter watched the film that Chicago unrolled for the boulevard pilgrims. The boats in the river, the long switch tracks of the railroads, the tall grain elevators, the low warehouses from which drifted alluring odors of the spices linked for James Thorold the older city of his youth with the newer one of his age, as the street linked one division of the city's geography with another. They were the means by which Chicago had risen from the sand flats of the 50s to the Michigan Avenue of the present. That wide street of the high skyline that fronted the world as it faced the Great Lakes, squarely, solidly, openly. They were the means, too, by which James Thorold had augmented his fortune until it had acquired the power to send him to Forsland. To him, however, they represented not ladders to prosperity, but a social condition of a passing generation, the Chicago of the 70s, a city distinctly American in population and in ideals, a youthful city of a single standard of endeavor, a pleasant place that had been swallowed by the Chicago of the present, that many-tentacled monster of heterogeneous races that affected him as it did so many of the older residents, with an overwhelming sensation of revolt against its sprawling lack of cohesion. Even the material advantages that had accrued to him from the growth of the city could not reconcile James Thorold to the fact that the elements of the city's growth came from the races of men whom he held in contempt. What mattered it, he reasoned, that Chicago waxed huge, when her grossness came from the unassimilated, indigestible mass of Latins and Greeks, Poles and Russians, Czechs, Bulgars, Jews, who filled the streets, the factories, and the schools? The prejudice, always strong within him, rose higher as he found his machine blocked again, this time by the crowd that stood across Jackson Boulevard at LaSalle Street. Even after the peremptory order of a mounted police officer had cleared the way for him, James Thorold frowned on the lines of men and women pressed back against the curbstones. The thought that they were waiting the coming of the body of that boy who had died in Mexico added to his annoyance the realization that he would have to fight his way through another crowd at the station if he wished to reach the train shed where Peter's train would come. The struggle was spared him, however, by the recognition of a newspaper reporter who took it for granted that the ambassador to Forsland had come to meet the funeral cortege of the Marine, and who led him through a labyrinthine passage that brought him past the gates and under the glass dome of the train shed. Left alone, Thorold paced the platform a little apart from the group of men who had evidently been delegated to represent the city. Some of them he knew, Others of them, men of Isidore Framberg's people and of the 10 tribes of Israel, he did not care to know. He turned away from them to watch the people beyond the gates. Thousands of faces, typical of every nation of Europe and some of the lands of Asia, fair Norsemen and Teutons, olive-skinned Italians, and men and women of the swarthier peoples of Palestine. Poles, Finns, Lithuanians, Russians, Bulgars, Bohemians, units of that mass which had welded in the city of the Great Lakes of America, looked out from behind the iron fence. The tensity written on their faces, eager yet awed, brought back to James Thorold another time when men and women had stood within a Chicago railway terminal waiting for a funeral cortege. The time when Illinois waited in sorrow to take Abraham Lincoln, dead, to her heart. The memory of that other day of dirges linked itself suddenly in the mind of James Thorold with the picture of the lilacs blooming in the yard of the Adams homestead on the Parkway. That old house where Abraham Lincoln had been wont to come, and the fusing recollections spun the ambassador to Forsland upon his heel, and sent him far down the platform, where he stood gloomily apart, until the Limited, rolling in from the end of the yards, brought him hastening to its side. Peter Thorold was first to alight. A boy of 16, fair-haired, blue-eyed, ruddy-cheeked, springing from the platform of the Pullman into his father's arms, he brought with him the atmosphere of high adventure. In height, in poise of shoulders, in bearing, in a certain trick of lifting his chin, he was a replica of the dignified man who welcomed him with deep emotion. But a difference, of dream rather than of dogma, in the quality of their temperaments accoladed the boy. It was not only that his voice thrilled with the higher enthusiasms of youth. It held, besides, an inflexibility of tone that James Thorold's lacked. Its timbre told that Peter Thorold's spirit had been tempered in a furnace fierier than the one which had given forth the older man's. The voice rang out now in excited pleasure as the boy gripped his father's shoulders. "Oh, but it's good to see you again, Dad," he cried. "You're a great old boy, and I'm proud of you, sir. Think of it," he almost shouted. "Ambassador to Forsland! Say, but that's bully!" He slipped his arm around his father's shoulder, while James Thorold watched him with eyes that shone with joy. "What do you call an ambassador?" he demanded laughingly. "Fortunately," the older man said, "there is no title accompanying the office." "Well, I should think not," the boy exclaimed. "Oh, Dad, isn't it the greatest thing in the world that you're to represent the United States of America?" James Thorold smiled. "No doubt," he said dryly, his gaze past his son to glimpse the crowd at the gate, frantic now with excitement, all looking forward toward some point on the platform just beyond where the man and boy were standing. "These United States of America have grown past my thought of them," he added. The boy caught up the idea eagerly. "Haven't they, though?" he demanded. "And isn't it wonderful to think that it's all the same old America, the land of the free and the home of the brave? Gee, but it's good to be back in it again. I came up into New York alongside the battleship that brought our boys home from Mexico," he went on. "And oh, say, Dad, you should have seen that harbor. I've seen a lot of things for a fellow," he pursued with a touch of boyish boastfulness. "But I never saw anything in all my life like that port yesterday. People and people and people waiting, and flags at half-mast, and a band off somewhere playing a funeral march, and that battleship with the dead sailors, the fellows who died for our country at Vera Cruz, you know, creeping up to the dock. Oh, it was... well, I cried." He made confession proudly, then hastened into less personal narrative. "One of them came from Chicago here," he said. "He was only 19 years old, and he was one of the first on the beach after the order to cross to the custom house. He lived over on Fourgear Street, one of the men was telling me. There's 6 of them, the guard of honor for him, on the train. His name was Isidore Freeberg. He was born in Russia, too, in Kiev, the place of the massacres, you remember? See, Dad, here comes the guard. Peter Thorold swung his father around until he faced 6 uniformed men who fell into step as they went forward toward the baggage car. It's too bad, isn't it, the boy continued, that any of the boys had to die down in that greaser town. But if they did, I'm proud that we proved up that Chicago had a hero to send. Aren't you, Dad? James Thorold didn't answer. Peter's hands closed over his arm. It reminds me, he said, lowering his voice as they came closer to the place where the Marine stood beside the iron carrier that awaited the casket of Isidore Freeberg's body, of something the tutor at Westbury taught us in Greek last year. Something in a funeral oration that a fellow in Athens made on the men who died in the Peloponnesian War. Such was the end of these men, he quoted slowly, pausing now and then for a word while his father looked wonderingly upon his rapt further. And they were worthy of Athens. The living need not desire to have a more heroic spirit. I would have you fix your eyes upon the greatness of Athens, until you become filled with the love of her. And when you are impressed by the spectacle of her glory, reflect that this empire has been acquired by men who knew their duty and who had the courage to do it, who, in the hour of conflict, had the fear of dishonor always present to them. With the solemnity of the chant, the young voice went on, while the flag-covered casket was lifted from car to bier. For the whole earth is the sepulchre of famous men. Not only are they commemorated by columns and inscriptions in their own country, but in foreign lands there dwells also an unwritten memorial of them, graven not in stone but in the hearts of men. Make them your examples, and esteeming courage to be freedom, and freedom to be happiness, do not weigh too nicely the perils of war. He pulled off his cap, tucking it under his arm and dragging his father with him to follow the men who had fallen in behind the Marines as they moved forward toward the gates and the silent crowd beyond. Almost unwillingly, James Thorold doffed his hat. The words of Peter's unexpected declamation of Pericles' oration resounded in his ears. Once before, he said to the boy, I heard that speech. Judge Adams said it one night to Abraham Lincoln. Father! Peter's eyes flashed back from the cortege to meet James Thorold's. I never knew that you knew Abraham Lincoln. His tone betokened an impression of having been cheated of some joy the older man had been hoarding. But James Thorold's voice held no joy. Yes, he said. I knew him. The gates, sliding back, opened the way for the officers who led the procession with which Isidore Freeberg came back to the city of his adoption. The crowd yawned to give space to the guard of honor, walking erectly beside the flag-draped coffin. To the mourners, men and women alien as if they had come from Kiev but yesterday. To the little group of men, public officials and rabbis, who trailed in their wake, and to James Thorold and Peter, reverently following. Then it closed in upon the cortege, urging it silently down the broad stairways and out into the street, where other crowds fell in with the strange procession. Surging away after the shabby hearse, drawn by its listless horses and attended by the Marines, the crowd left the Thorolds, father and son, on the pavement beside the station. Don't you want to go? There was a wistfulness in Peter's voice that told his father that the boy had sensed some lack of responsiveness in him. He's going to lie in state today at the City Hall. Don't you think we should go, Dad?" Not Peter's query, but Peter's eyes won his father's answer. "After a while," he promised. "Then let's find a breakfast," the boy laughed. "I spent my last dollar sending you that telegram." All the way over to his father's club on Michigan Avenue, and all through the breakfast that he ordered with lusty young appetite, Peter kept up a running fire of reminiscence of his European adventures. That the fire held grape-shot for his father when he talked of the latter's worthiness for the ambassadorship to Forsland, he could not guess. But he found that he was pouring salt in a wound when he went back to comment upon Isidor Framberg's death. "Why make so much of a boy who happened to be at Vera Cruz?" the older man said at last, nettled that even his son found greater occasion for commendation in the circumstance of the Fournier Street hero than in his father's selection to the most important diplomatic post in the gift of the government. Peter's brows rose swiftly at his father's annoyance. He opened his lips for argument, then swiftly changed his intention. "Tell me about Judge Adams, Dad," he said, bungling over his desire to change the topic. "The fellow who knew his Pericles." "It's too long a story," James Thorold said. He watched Peter closely in the fashion of an advocate studying the characteristics of a judge. The boy's idealism, his vivid young patriotism, his eager championship of those elements of the new America that his father condemned, had fired his personality with a glaze that left James Thorold's smoothly diplomatic fingers wandering over its surface, unable to hold it within his grasp. He had a story to tell Peter, sometime, a story of Judge Adams, of the house among the lilacs, of days of war, of Abraham Lincoln, but the time for its telling must wait upon circumstance that would make Peter Thorold more ready to understand weakness and failure than he now seemed. Consciously, James Thorold took a change of venue from Peter Thorold of the visions to Peter Thorold of the inevitable disillusions. But to the former he made concession. "Shall we go to the City Hall now?" he asked, as they rose from the table. The City Hall, a massive white granite pile covering half of the square east of LaSalle Street and north of Washington, and meeting its twin of the county building to form a solid mass of masonry, flaunted black drapings over the doorways through which James Thorold and his son entered. Through a wide corridor of bronze and marble they found their way, passing a few stragglers from the great crowd that had filled the lower floors of the huge structures when Isidor Framberg's body had been brought from the hearse and carried to the center of the aisles, the place where the intersecting thoroughfares met. Under a great bronze lamp stood the catafalque, covered with the stars and stripes, and guarded by the men of the fleet. Peter Thorold, pressing forward, took his place, his cap thrust under his arm, at the foot of the bier, giving his tribute of silence to the boy who had died for his country. But James Thorold went aside to stand beside an elevator shaft. Had his son watched him as he was watching Peter, he would have seen the swift emotions that took their way across his father's face. He would have seen the older man's look dilate with the strained horror of one who gazed back through the dimming years to see a ghost. He would have seen sorrow and grief and a great remorse rising to James Thorold's eyes. He might even have seen the shadow of another bier cast upon the retina of his father's sight. He might have seen, through his father's watching, the memory of another man who had once lain on the very spot where Isidor Framberg was lying. A man who had died for his country, after he had lived to set his country among the free nations of the earth. But Peter Thorold saw only the boy who had gone from a Fournier Street tenement to the Mexican sands, that he might prove, by his dying, that, with Irish and Germans and French, he, too, the lad who had been born in Kiev of the massacres, was an American. With the surge of strange emotions flooding his heart, Peter Thorold crossed to where his father stood apart. The tide of his thought overflowed the shore of prose and landed his expression high on a cliff of poetry. No chance, but the urging of his own exalted mood brought him the last lines of Moody's Ode in Time of Hesitation. Then on your guiltier head shall our intolerable self-disdain wreak suddenly its anger and its pain. For manifest in that disastrous light we shall discern the right, and do it tardily. O ye who lead, take heed. Blindness we may forgive, but baseness we will smite. But to the older man, seeing as he stood the picture of that other catafalque to which he had crept one night in the lilac time of a year nearly half a century agone, the words flung anathema. He leaned back against the bronze grating of the shaft with a sudden look of age that brought Peter's protective arm to his shoulder. Then, with Peter following, he went out to the sun-bright street. Like a man in a daze, he dismissed his car, crossing pavements under Peter's guiding until he came to the building where the fortunes of the great Thorold mercantile business were administered. Through the outer room, where clerks looked up in surprise at the appearance which their chief presented on the morning when they had learned of the Forsland embassy, he led Peter until they came to the room where he had reigned for 20 years. It was a room that had always mirrored James Thorold to his son. Tall bookcases, stiff, old-fashioned, held long rows of legal works, books on history, essays on ethical topics, and bound volumes of periodicals. Except for its maps, it was a lawyer's room, although James Thorold never claimed either legal ability or legal standing. Peter seldom entered it without interest in its possibilities of entertainment, but today his father's strange and sudden preoccupation of manner engulfed all the boy's thought. "What is it, Dad?" he asked, a tightening fear screwing down upon his brain as he noted the change that had come over the mask that James Thorold's face held to the world. James Thorold made him no answer. He was standing at the wide walnut table, turning over and over in his hands the letters which his secretary had left for his perusal. Finally he opened one of them, the bulkiest. He scanned it for a moment, then flung it upon the floor. Then he began to pace the room, till in his striding he struck his foot against the paper he had cast aside. He picked it up, tossing it toward Peter. The boy turned from his strained watching of his father's face to read the letter. It was the official notification of the Senate's confirmation of the President's appointment of James Thorold as ambassador to the court of St. Jerome. "Why, Father!" Incredulity heightened the boyishness in Peter's tone. James Thorold wheeled around till he faced him. "Peter," he said huskily, "there's something you'll have to know before I go to Forsland, if ever I go to Forsland. You'll have to decide." The boy shrank from the ominous cadence of the words. "Why, I can't judge for you, Dad," he said awkwardly. "Our children are always our ultimate judges," James Thorold said. "I've sometimes wondered," he went on, speaking to himself rather than to the puzzled boy, "how the disciples who met Christ but who did not go his way with him to the end felt when they heard that he had died. I knew a great man once, Peter. I went his way for a little while, and then I took my own. I saw them bring him, dead, over the way they have brought that boy today. I came down to the courthouse that night, and there, just where that boy lies, Peter, I made a promise that I have not kept." Again he resumed his pacing, speaking as he went, sometimes in low tones, sometimes with tensity of voice, always as if urged by some force that was driving him from silence. The boy, leaning forward at the edge of the chair, watched his father through the first part of the story. Before the end came, he turned away. "You remember," James Thorold began, his voice pleading patience, "that I've told you I came to Chicago from Ohio before the war? I was older than you then, Peter, but I was something of a hero worshiper, too. Judge Adams was my hero in those troublous times of the 50s. I knew him only by sight for a long time, watching him go in and out of the big white house where he lived. After a time, I came to know him. I was clerking in a coffee importing house during the day and studying law at night. Judge Adams took me into his office. He took me among his friends. Abraham Lincoln was one of them. I remember the night I met Lincoln. Judge Adams had talked of him often. He had been talking of him that day. "Greatness," he had said, "is the holding of a great dream, not for yourself, but for others. Abraham Lincoln has the dream. He has heard the voice and seen the vision, and he is climbing up to Sinai. You must meet him, James." That night I met him in the old White House. We were in the front parlor of the old house, James Thorold continued, resetting the scene until his only listener knew that it was more real to him than the room through which he paced. When someone said, "Mr. Lincoln," I looked up to see a tall, awkward man standing in the arched doorway. Other men have said that they had to know Lincoln a long time to feel his greatness. My shame is the greater that I felt his greatness on the instant when I met his eyes. There was talk of war that night. Lincoln did not join in it, I remember, although I do not recall what he said, but when he rose to go, I went with him. We walked down the street past dooryards where lilacs were blooming, keeping together till we crossed the river. There our ways parted. I told him a little of what Judge Adams had said of him. He laughed at the praise, waving it away from himself. "It's a good thought, though," he said. "A great dream for others. But we need more than the dreaming, my friend. When the time comes, will you be ready?" I held out my hand to him in pledge. My way home that night took me past the armory where the Zouaves, the boys whom Ellsworth trained, were drilling. You remember Ellsworth's story, Peter? He was the first officer to die in the war. The boy nodded solemnly, and the man went on. With Abraham Lincoln's voice ringing in my ears, I enlisted. Years afterward, when Abraham Lincoln was president, war came. I'd seen Lincoln often in the years between. James Thorold stopped his restless pacing and stood at the end of the table, away from Peter, leaning over it slightly, as he seemed to keep up his story with difficulty. He came often to Judge Adams' house. There were evenings when the three of us sat in the parlor with the dusk drifting in from the lake and spoke of the future of the nation. Judge Adams thought war inevitable. Abraham Lincoln thought it could be averted. They both dreaded it. I was young, and I hoped for it. "What'll you do, Jim, if war should come?" they asked me once. "I'd go as a private," I told them. If the war had come then, I should have gone with the 1st Regiment out. But when the call sounded, Ellsworth had gone to New York, and the Zouaves had merged with another regiment. I didn't go with them in the beginning because I told myself that I wanted to be with the 1st troop that went from Illinois to the front. I didn't join until after Lincoln had sent out his call for volunteers. "You see," he explained to the silent boy, "I had left Judge Adams' office and struck out for myself. Chicago was showing me golden opportunities. Before me, if I stayed, stretched a wide road of success." "And you didn't go?" Peter interrupted his father for the first time. "I thought—" His voice broke. "I went," James Thorold said. "The regiment, the 19th, was at the border when Lincoln gave the call. There was a bounty being offered to join it. I would have gone anyhow, but I thought that I might just as well take the money. I was giving up so much to go, I reasoned. And so I took the bounty. The provost marshal gave me the money in the office right across the square from the old courthouse. I put it in the bank before I started south. I left Chicago that night with a great thrill. I was going to fight for a great cause, for Abraham Lincoln's great dream, for the country my father had died for in Mexico, that my grandfather had fought for at Lundy's Lane. I think, he said, that if I might have gone right down to the fighting, I'd have stood the test. But when I came to Tennessee, the regiment had gone stale. We waited and waited. Every day I lost a little interest. Every day the routine dragged a little harder. I had time to see what opportunities I had left back here in Chicago. I wasn't afraid of the fighting, but the sheer hatred of what I came to call the uselessness of war gnawed at my soul. I kept thinking of the ways in which I might shape my destiny if only I were free. I kept thinking of the 1,000 roads to wealth, to personal success that Chicago held for me. And one night I took my chance. I slipped past the lines. "Father!" The boy's voice throbbed with pain. His eyes dilated with horror at the realization of the older man's admission, fixed their gaze accusingly on James Thorold. "You weren't a deserter?" He breathed the word fearfully. "I was a bounty jumper." "Oh!" Peter Thorold's shoulders drooped as if under the force of a vital blow. Vaguely, as he knew the term, the boy knew only too well the burden of disgrace that it carried. Once, in school, he had heard an old tutor apply it to some character of history whom he had especially despised. Again, in a home where he had visited, he had heard another old man use the phrase in contempt for some local personage who had attempted to seek public office. Bounty jumper! Its province expressed to the lad's mind a layer of the inferno beneath the one reserved for the Benedict Arnolds and the Aaron Burrs. Vainly he bugled his own troops of self-control. But they, too, were deserters in the calamity. He flung his arms across the table, surrendering to his sobs. Almost impassively, James Thorold watched him, as if he himself had gone so far back into his thought of the past that he could not bridge the gap to Peter now. With some thought of crossing the chasm, he took up his tale of dishonor. Punctuated by the boy's sobs, it went on. "I came back to Chicago and drew the money from the bank. I knew I couldn't go back to the practice of law. I changed my name to Thorold and started in business as an army contractor. I made money. The money that's made us rich. The money that's sending me to Forsland." A bitterness not in his voice before edged his mention of the embassy. It came from that bounty that the provost marshal gave me. He turned his back upon the sobbing boy, walked over to the window, and staring outward upon the April brightness of the noonday ere he spoke again. "You know of the 19th's record? They were at Nashville, and they were at Chattanooga after my colonel came back dead. I went out of Chicago when his body was brought in. Then Turchin took command of the brigade. The 19th went into the big fights. They were at Chickamauga. Benton fell there. He'd been in Judge Adams' office with me. After I'd come back, he'd joined the regiment. The day the news of Chickamauga came, I met Judge Adams on Washington Street. He knew me. He looked at me as Peter might have looked at Judas." Slowly, Peter Thorold raised his head from his arms, staring at the man beside the window. James Thorold met his look with somber sorrow. "Don't think I've had no punishment," he said. "Remember that I loved Judge Adams, and I loved Abraham Lincoln." "Oh, no, no!" The boy's choked utterance came in protest. "If you really cared for them, you wouldn't have failed them. "I have prayed," his father said, "that you may never know the grief of having failed the men you have loved. There is no heavier woe, Peter." Again his gaze went from the boy, from the room, from the present. "I did not see Abraham Lincoln again until he was dead," he said. They brought him back and set his bier in the old courthouse. The night he lay there, I went in past the guards and looked long upon the face of him who had been my friend. I saw the sadness and the sorrow, the greatness and the glory, that life and death had sculptured there. He had dreamed, and he had done. When the time had come, he had been ready. I knelt beside his coffin, and I promised God and Abraham Lincoln that I would, before I died, make atonement for the faith I had broken. Peter's sobbing had died down to husky flutterings of breath, but he kept his face averted from the man at the other side of the table. "I meant to make some sort of reparation," James Thorold explained, listlessness falling like twilight on his mood, as if the sun had gone down on his power. "But I was always so busy, and there seemed no real occasion for sacrifice. I never sought public office or public honors till I thought you wanted me to have them, Peter." He turned directly to the boy, but the boy did not move. "I was so glad of Forsland yesterday. Through all these years I have told myself that, after all, I had done no great wrong. But sometimes, when the bands were playing and the flags were flying, I knew that I had turned away from the Grail after I had looked upon it. I knew it today, when I stood beside that boy's coffin. I had said that times change. I know now that only the time changes. The spirit does not die, but it's a stream that goes underground to come up, a clear spring, in unexpected places. My father died in Mexico. I failed my country, and Isidor Freeberg dies at Vera Cruz." "For our country," the boy said bitterly. "And his own," his father added. "For him, for his people, for all these who walk in darkness, Abraham Lincoln died. The gleam of his torch shone far down their lands. His message brought them here. They have known him even as I, who walked with him in life, did not know him until today, and they are paying him. That dead boy is their offering to him, their message that they are the Americans." Into Peter Thorold's eyes, as he looked upon his father, leaped a flash of blue fire. Searchingly he stared into the face of the older man, as Galahad might have gazed upon a sorrowing Percival. "You're going to give up Forsland?" he breathed, touching the paper on the table. "I gave up Forsland," James Thorold said, "when I saw you at Isidor Freeberg's side. I knew that I was not worthy to represent your America, and his." He held out his hands to Peter longingly. The boy's strong one closed over them. Peter Thorold, sighting the mansion of his father's soul, saw that the other man had passed the portals of confession into an empire of expiation mightier than the court of St. Jerome. End of section 24.